Does that make sense?
Does that make sense?
Does that make sense?
Do you understand? Does that make sense?
But does that make sense for her to sabotage her own theater?
Does that make sense to you?
Jesus, does that make sense?
And does that make sense?
Does that make sense?
This thing in my life where the most random, unrandom things happen to me all the time, does that make sense?
Does that make sense, David?
Does that make sense?
Does that make sense?
Does that make sense?
Does it make sense?
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
How does that make sense?
Does that make sense?
Does that make sense?
Wait, does that make sense? Forgot to surprise you?
Does that make sense?
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Something about sailing, does that make sense?
That's not a curse. Does that make sense?
Does that make sense?
Sure.